I'm a third-year doctoral student here at GTU, working in theology and science. I worked for 7 years prior to coming here at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, where I did cancer research on brain tumors. Specifically, I was culturing stem cell lines. And the difficulty with doing that is you have to keep the stem cell from differentiating. So I worked a lot on how to do that. And actually my boss was just recently published. Huge deal on telomeres. And if anybody wants to look that up, I can give you the gene for it. But anyway, I am working now with TED. I'm teaching at PLTS. I'm teaching systematic theology, which is a lot of fun, and I'm in my special comps. And why isn't this duplicating? There we go. Almost ready. So as a biologist, I am interested in evolution. It's sort of a general category, but in specific, I was more concerned with the human body. Studies like systems theory and organisms. So I'm going to apply that. A lot of my work is asking about that, and I want to apply those systems theories and how we are embodied into a theology, a systematic theology. So I'm going to talk about embodied grace, the biological body, and the happy exchange. The happy exchange is Martin Luther's famous atonement theory, in which sin is exchanged for grace. All right, so before I go into that, I'm going to come clean up front, as Dr. Peters tells me any good theologian should do, with method and presuppositions. And my first presupposition is going to be that it's dual aspect monism, and this term comes from John Polkinghorne. And basically it just means that there's one stuff in the universe, and reality is neither one stuff, but we experience primarily two dual aspects of that, one being mind and the other being matter. But they are two different abstractions from a prior reality. The second presupposition is emergent holism. I'm taking this term from Dr. Peters' book, God and the World's Future. And emergent holism is a theory that, or a paradigm mostly, that we work with that says there are emerging holes in reality. Everything is connected because we have the one stuff, and then we see different levels of this reality at different levels of complexity. A good example of that could be single-celled organisms, and then you have tissue, systems, and then you have a human being, a human consciousness. And my final presupposition is that human beings are a psychosomatic unity of body and mind. And that would also then include soul. Okay, so my method, I'm going to use, when I write my dissertation, when I finally get there, I'm going to use Paul Tillich's method of correlation, and I am also going to combine that with Dr. Russell's method of creative mutual interaction, because like Bob's fundamental insight is that it is not enough to say that science can inform our theology. We also need to be able to speak back to science. Just hang on a second, let me move this over here. So there we go. All right, so the motivating question that I have behind my research is how does the death and resurrection of Christ exchange the sin implicit in our very biological being for Christ's grace? And I understand, and I'll admit up front, that this part right here is a presupposition of mine, that there is sin implicit in the way that we are made. Oh, look who it is. Furthermore, how might that grace be holistically, and when I say holistically, I mean physically and mentally efficacious? So what impact does the grace that we receive from Christ actually have on our being? And not just on our mental being and our spiritual being, but on us physically, what happens to us. All right, just a small question. What is life? We really struggle with this as biologists. There's not one single definition that I can give you that would categorize exactly what it is to be alive. A lot of scientists have said, and this was really popular when I was in school, that life reproduces. That it has to be able to reproduce. That was sort of the thing then. But there's been a lot of different categorizations that have been offered, such as dying and speciation. Metabolic processes is also another big one. What I'm going to lean towards to answer this, I'm going to follow Lynn Margulies, and there are two South American philosophers of the mind. Well, they do theory of the mind, and they developed the Santiago theory of the mind. There's Varela and Maturana. There are the last names. And they work with autopoiesis. And autopoiesis means self-making. So there are three different characterizations that we use for something to be an autopoietic system, a living system. It has to be self-organizing and self-contained. So in this diagram here, basically we want to pay attention, just for our sake, for this talk, we want to pay attention to the circle. There's an organizational boundary that I have around myself, that all living beings have around themselves to compose themselves as an individual living being. The second characteristic is dissipative system. It's a dissipative structure, and what that means is that you take in food, air, you take in from the environment, and you process that for energy, and you release that as waste. And it is that that allows you to live far from equilibrium, from thermodynamic equilibrium. So that's how we circumvent the laws of physics as living beings, and all living structures do this. And we actually produce more energy outward in the form of waste and heat than we are taking in. So we're still in line with the universe, even though we're complex systems. And the final criteria for an autopoietic system is cognition. You have to have some form of mind. And even bacteria, single cells, have a form of mind. They have, they'll be attracted to light, so they have a way of sensing and moving towards or away from light. It could be heat, it could be acidic environment or lack of acidity. So all organisms have a way to perceive their environment. And in fact, one of my favorite things about this theory, I think it's a really cool way to say it, is that every living organism, according to its own genetic makeup, brings forth its own world. It has its own way of perceiving and navigating the environment, and that's the world it brings forth. That's how the ant sees the world. That's how the human being sees the world. Okay, so parts of the system then, if we're going to think about this as a more complex system, parts of the system then interact in increasingly complex organisms to create a more and more complex whole. So even within, that's what the organization is. It's how that structure, the organism, is organized. And in that organization, how do the different parts work together to make a whole? The reason that that is important is because this whole then can't be reduced. It can't be reduced to the atoms that comprise this whole. That's not enough to say, I have so many carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, and that's what makes this human being. That does not work anymore. Okay, so the human biological body, if we look at the human body through the lens of autopoiesis, we can discern that the body is the human person. However, the human person is not just the body. The self-consciousness emerges from the body. Another way of saying this is that the mind cannot be reduced to just the brain. But you have to have the body, you have to have the brain in order to have the mind, in order to have the human being. So what we end up having is we have all these even complex parts in and of themselves interacting to create a highly complex whole. So that actually the connections and relationships in between the parts of your body in your system, they kind of take on a life of their own. They contribute to what makes you a human being. And it's from that self-consciousness emerges. So the network gives rise to your mental faculties. And then the whole point of this is really to say, because this is such an important theological concept here, is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So that's the case for human beings. It's the case for all organisms. You end up having a whole that cannot be reduced to the physical parts because that mental aspect matters. Okay, so now, sin in the biological body. I've been working this out for a couple of years now. Chipping away at it. And this is what I think so far. Autopoietic systems are characterized by, so I'm going to make some philosophical assumptions based on what we just talked about scientifically now, okay? So I'm going to say that the autopoietic system is characterized by isolation and relation. Here is the boundary, or a good way to describe, it's a good way to envision and conceptualize, even though this is not a literal image by any means, please don't take it that way. This is just a good way to conceptualize how I, as an individual, interact with the environment. I have a boundary around myself, and yet I have ways to let things in and to let things out. So I'm isolated as an individual by my boundary, and yet I have to relate to the environment. And isolation is neither one of these things in and of themselves is a bad or a good thing. They just are. They're the way we are. So there's no moral category here right now at all. There's no value judgment. So you can't be either fully relational or fully individual or fully isolated. You're kind of stuck right here in this in-between in order to exist as a body at all. So my hypothesis is that sin emerges from this state of being at the self-conscious level of biological complexity. Why do I hypothesize that? Because I am isolated in myself. I have to be, or I can't be an individual, I can't be a body. But that isolation keeps me from fully knowing and fully understanding the world around me. I don't know what it is to be an ant, therefore I don't know how to really treat an ant. I don't even know what it is to fully be myself because I'm not fully an individual. So therefore I don't know how to fully treat myself correctly as an individual. So this in-between, this tense place, is the way we are physically made. So I believe, it's my hypothesis that that is biologically the place to point to for where sin comes from. I'm stuck, I can't get out of this. We all are. So I'm using these biological categories to discuss a theological doctrine now. And I did that by making a philosophical analogy here, by pulling in these terms. And I want to point to this as, but that isn't to say that this is just an analogy. It's very, very real that this is the way that we are made. And it's very, very really at our self-conscious level where we have such an effective causality in the world that this becomes sin. Okay? Everything is made this way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that an ant is capable of sin. And we all, those of us that are involved in this dialogue all the time are well aware that we're considering whether or not dolphins sin. This would be for the same reasons. It's the way that we're made. So there's something wrong with the way that we're made, the way that life has come to be. Okay, so the biology of Jesus Christ. I love this picture. I love, love, love this painting because here you have baby Jesus. And the baby Jesus was really born from that mother. That's a real biological body. That really came out of mom's real biological body. So the characteristics of Jesus Christ would have been that Jesus was a living autopoietic system just like us. Theologically, we're also going to say that Jesus was fully God and fully human. And the third thing that I'm going to stick by when it comes to Jesus is that Jesus was sinless. How can that possibly be? I just said that these two don't go together, or that these don't go together. So, my hypothesis then is that Jesus Christ was the first true human being, a fulfilled autopoietic system who is fully individual and fully relational. How? I believe that Jesus had something that we don't. And I don't mean like an extra appendix. I don't mean a physical thing that I could point to and say, I need one of those. How do I get that? I mean that there is a state of being that Jesus is in or possesses that I don't have access to on my own. None of us do. What is that difference? All right, so I'm going to put a pin in that difference for a minute. And we're going to talk about what the happy exchange is. Okay, the happy exchange for Martin Luther happens between the cross and the focal events of the happy exchange are the cross and the resurrection. And on the cross, Christ takes on our sin. So in the language and the lens in which I'm looking at this, I would say that Christ takes on this tension, the state of being in which I'm not fully individual and I'm not fully relational. That's what Christ is taking on. And not just for me, for everything that has being. So it is more than sin that Christ is actually taking on. Christ is taking on the what has gone wrong. And then there's the resurrection. Christ has been raised. Christ gives us with Christ's grace that Christ had the whole time. And to be graced is then to have fullness of life that we're intended to have, which would make me fully individual and fully relational and everybody else and everything else. That's the goal. The difference is grace. If anybody knows me, they know I love, love, love my dog. This is Gracie. She's the difference. And you would believe it if you knew her. And so here, I'm going to use more than just autopoiesis and information theory, but for the sake of this presentation, I kind of picked 2 pieces of evidence out of 6. And my second use, which is super important if we're going to talk about the happy exchange, is going to be grace as information and information theory. Because it's not a physical thing. This is why I want to use it. Information is not physical. It's not a missing appendix. That would fall apart. Okay. So, Gregory Bateson, pioneer in information theory, says that information is the difference that makes a difference. So information theory would be the difference that Christ has that makes a difference in the being that Christ is. And if I receive that grace, it makes a difference in me. So, in the happy exchange, Christ exchanges our sin, the what's gone wrong, for the grace that God freely gives us. And when we receive that, it's communicated to us. So if information is always communicated, grace is communicated in the same way akin to the way information is communicated. So I'm using this as a model. And then grace, the receipt of that grace resolves the tension that we're in. Only with that grace are you fully individual and fully relational. So grace then has to be efficacious to a living system. If we look to the biblical text, we have miracles and we have healings. Get up and walk. The blind man can see. This grace that we receive via information is physically efficacious. So that would be a top-down methodology. I receive grace. It has an impact on, let's see, the dimensions that are accessible to my self-consciousness. It has an impact on the mind. And that can work downward into your very being. Get up and walk. Your physical being. And then this also has, I also want to say that grace is not only efficacious at a physical level, it is efficacious for your self-consciousness. It fulfills your consciousness of who you are and who you are called to be, and it fulfills your consciousness of others. Who are they called to be, and how do I let them be that? This difference is very, very real. It is the most real. Okay, so implications and conclusions from what I'm working on and thinking about. This provides a platform for discussing the bodily resurrection. Well, what does that mean? What do I mean about that? If grace is actually physically efficacious and it can have an impact on a physical system, then that means that physical systems can be transformed by grace, which means that in the general resurrection, physical systems can be transformed. So this could be a theological theory that could support and provide a framework for discussing the bodily resurrection. Okay, embodied atonement, my whole goal is here, that talking about actual embodied atonement, I want to describe the role of biology in the world's and creation's fallenness. And it's in quotes because I don't mean it literally. I mean that something's gone wrong. How is it that our biology is related to that? Well, communication, and I also want to describe what happens to us when we receive grace as a physically embodied human being and creation period. And then also the efficacy of grace for creation, not just for humanity. So that's where I'm at.
So let's say up to 5 minutes for some Q&A.
Shoot.
Jimmy?
Hi, how are you?
Good, and you?
Good.
I'm more interested in your definition of sin.
Yeah.
What will that be? What do you mean by this sin that is embedded in our biological system, or this wrong that is?
Okay, so you want me to define sin, period. Okay. Well, for sin, in order as a Lutheran and a faithful Lutheran, for me to define sin, it isn't necessarily going to be about what I'm not doing right, or it's not going to be based on moral grounds. My definition wouldn't necessarily be moral. It begins with the fact that ontologically something is the matter. And in that space of something is the matter, you're bound to it. So it means that, to be very orthodox and to use the appropriate terms, your heart is not set on God. Your heart is turned in on itself.
From the beginning.
From the beginning. And it doesn't mean that we're not, there are other issues here that this goes, I'd have to go way into the two kingdoms and what are we capable of, what kind of grace do we have, period, like list off the different types of grace. So I don't want to be uncategorically about it, like I recognize exactly where you're going with that. There are different types of grace. Can I do anything good from the very beginning? Sure. But it's probably always going to be about yourself until you get this kind of grace.
Nice. Thank you.
Referring to the same question that he asked, it looks like God is creating us sinful. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. And I don't mean that it's intentional. I mean it's what's happened. But I know what you mean. Like if you back this up and you do a good job as a systematic theologian and you back this up, it's like, well, what's he doing? What's he or she doing? What's going on there? Because it's a huge theodicy problem. I get it. But I think we have to answer to that. I don't think you can shy away from it, especially not with all the work that everybody's done with evolution and theology. We have to say something to that. It looks bad.
Is there a difference between humans and other animals, and how did that?
Yeah, I think that I would put that on a spectrum as far as levels of self-consciousness and complexity. And it's super, of course it's difficult to do that. It's difficult for any one of us because it comes from the very nature of our being. I can't be inside an orca or a killer whale or a dolphin or my dog. I don't know what that experience is like. I'm not aware of exactly what they're aware of. However, I think that if epistemology models ontology, that maybe we could expect, because we see certain behaviors, we might be able to say with fairness that given that they have a certain category of behaviors that seem kind of human, it's a possibility that sin is there as well. Does that make sense?
I was hoping that there would be something super special about us that makes us different from,
I think what makes us different, is that Christ comes as a human being.
in some sense?
That Christ becomes
Oh,
human.
okay.
I think it's God's action that makes us different. I would not, as an evolutionary biologist, I can't in any way pull us off of that continuum.
But before,
I can't pull humanity off of the continuum of evolution and be honest as a biologist.